Hi there, welcome to our short video on frequently asked questions with regards to social license to operate. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the wonderful Dr. Cathryn MacCallum, who is queen of all things social license to operate. So Cathryn, we've got some quick fire questions for you, if that's okay.
That's fine. Fire away.
Brilliant. So first things first, what on earth is this thing called social license to operate? What is it?
Social license to operate. Well, it's a term that's been about for about 30 years now. It actually came from a mining executive in Canada called Jim Cooney, but it's been generally sort of adopted across the mining industry globally. And it speaks to acceptance. It's about the informal acceptance of a project in an area. And if a project is accepted, it is deemed to have a social license to operate.
So am I correct in saying that your social license to operate, it is not a piece of paper or anything physical? It's actually, I guess, trust and respect with people in that area?
Yeah, it's a sum of the relationships really. If it is about trust, it is about respect, it is about all of the things that generate sort of acceptance of being in an area and working in an area. So it ties into sort of to what you do, how you communicate, how you behave, commitments that you make, promises you make, whether or not they're fulfilled. But it's also broader because it's about the actions of an individual company or a project, but it's also about what else is going on sort of in that area as well, because you can have a company doing everything sort of by the letter, by the book, to the best of their ability. But if they've walked into a hornet's nest, they're going to get stung. So it is a lot more complex than I think the narrative sort of give it to be or make it be.
Excellent. So beware of the hornet's nests because they make life a little bit more complicated for all of us. Thank you for that. So the second question I've got here is, so we've got social license to operate, but then we also have social performance. Are the two of them linked?
So we have social license to operate, but for some in industry, it started to be regarded as a tick box exercise. And as you know, Sarah, sort of in terms of the world of risk management and risk assessment as well, if people have a box they can tick, then they feel they've resolved the issue, but very rarely does that resolve the issue at hand. And likewise with social license to operate. So the tick box that's been identified is if we have no conflict and we have no protests at the gate, we can tick the box, we have a social license to operate. This has then given rise to an increased sort of attention on something called social performance. Again, it's not a new term, it's a term that's been around in industry for a very long time. But in relation to the minerals and mining sector, it has been is getting increased prominence as the sum of all of the interactions of a mining project or mineral exploration project. So it's the sum of your relationships, it's the sum of who you engage with, how you engage with them, what you do, and what is the legacy of your work in an area. However, currently, social performance doesn't necessarily speak to the context. So if you are a company that has got fantastic social performance credibility, but you are existing in this hornet's nest, without understanding that context, you might not be able to achieve a social license to operate. So social performance needs to consider the context as well to enable it then to achieve a social license to operate. And a social license to operate needs to be more than tick box exercise. It is informal, it is acceptance, but it is about understanding what is required to achieve that acceptance. Broadly speaking, acceptance is achieved by contextual understanding, seeing where you fit in the world, understanding the relationships between your project and the governance structures that regulate your actions, your relationship with the communities and the regions that host your project, but also understanding the existing relationships between the regions and the communities that host your projects and the governance and regulatory structures that are there. And it's about the sum of all of those relationships and navigating your place within those.
Brilliant. So it's not simple, basically.
No, there's an old English saying which says, "As naught as queer as folk," and and as a geologist, you will know, once you discover a mineral asset, there might be some really, really complex mineralogy around it that makes it difficult sort of to extract. But that mineralogy is static for the most part, not in geological terms, but in human terms, it's static. Um, the most fluid issue that sort of from a mineral perspective that has to be considered is water and the hydrogeology and how that affects things. But again, the movement of water is predictable and manageable to some extent. However, when it comes to people will say something one day, they will change their mind sort of 5 minutes after agreeing. Something will happen, something will change. They are complex, they are evolving, they are constantly moving. And for that reason, just irrespective of what the structures and processes are in place, social issues are undeniably complex. Yes.
And so I guess with regards to that, and this is a very simple question, and I think I know what the answer is. I imagine that, be it social performance, social license to operate, and of course that broader context, it's going to be unique for every single project everywhere in the world. Is that correct?
Yes, and there are sort of some international standards that guide good practice. Interestingly, these international standards are a requirement in non-OECD countries, which I find particularly interesting. So for the most of Europe, who are members, not all of Europe, but for the most of Europe and the most of the EU, who are members of the OECD, the Organisation for Economic and Cooperative Development, they are not bound by the international standards. And so what they are required to do depends on the individual sort of European or OECD member countries. If you're in a non-OECD country, then you have a whole host of standards, such as the International sort of Finance Corporation of the World Bank's performance standards, or you have the Equator Principles and various other sort of standards, international standards that are out there, the African Development Bank standards and principles and various others, which actually set a series of requirements of what needs to be done in terms of environmental and social management practice, which then contribute to achieving a social license to operate. If you're in an OECD country, you're bound by planning law for the most part, from a social perspective. And very few OECD countries, especially within the European context, actually have mining and mineral legislation. Finland does, and it's quite special. And then you have the added complication in a lot of European states, you have semi-autonomous regions. So if you take Spain as a country or the UK as a European country, the planning law that determines what people do and how people are considered in a process is not governed by the UK or by Spain. It's governed by Andalusia or by Galicia or Catalonia or by Wales or by Scotland or by Northern Ireland or by England. And so again, jurisdiction is not even national, it can be subnational. So it's incredibly complicated. And so what the requirements are vary from where you are in the world. But people, as a rule, tend to want to be treated with respect. They tend to want to have their concerns listened to and considered in a process. And where possible, they want to be able to consent to a project. And if they don't consent to a project, to have their lack of consent taken seriously and really as part of a decision-making process.
So I guess with regards to that, so you've got incredibly varied and unique contexts in which people are operating.
Mm-hmm.
However, coming back to your old English saying, "Naught as queer as folk," so nothing's as strange as people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we're all people. So actually, there is almost there's some sort of constant that comes through that.
Yes.
And you mentioned consent, which of course triggers the question: this thing, free and prior informed consent, or FPIC. Can you explain what is FPIC and where is it being used?
Okay, FPIC, free, prior and informed consent, is a particular layer of additional consideration that is afforded to Indigenous and, or depending on which international sort of criteria you follow, sort of marginalised rural sort of communities, but Indigenous communities or marginalised rural communities. The World Bank sort of environment and social sort of sustainability framework actually includes the rural marginalised communities, whereas the International Finance Corporation's performance standards just focus on Indigenous people. To be Indigenous, it means sort of to be of a grouping with a distinct heritage, distinct language, distinct culture, and distinct relationship to the natural resources of a geographical area. So free, prior, informed consent has come about as an acknowledgement of, for many, many years and hundreds of years, people within this designation, this cultural designation, have had their human rights overlooked by industry and by people wanting to use the land for other purposes, and they were not considered. And so they have been persecuted, really, all over the world, including Europe. So FPIC came about as an acknowledgement of this and a way of starting to address some of the imbalance in terms of determining what should be done and where it should be done without considering local people or Indigenous people's opinions and values. It's not a legal requirement in many countries. It is a legal requirement in countries that have signed up to the International Labour Organisation's 169 Convention on Indigenous People. And for countries that have signed up and ratified that international convention, it is a requirement. And it requires Indigenous people, and in some cases rural marginalised communities, to be given information about a proposed project freely before a project begins, before it completes its planning, so at early stage, sort of before scoping, and then through the scoping process, and to be integral to the scoping process. And it requires for them to be given all of the information that is required for them to be able to make a decision as to whether or not a project should happen in, on, or around the natural resources upon which their livelihoods depend. So that's really what it is. The discussion out there at the moment is if consent is a one-off, or if people are allowed to change their minds as a project progresses. There is a large school of thought which is pushing for consent to be a continued and reviewed process and not something that is signed off as a permit and then people can do what they want. However, not having that continuity then poses issues in terms of the profitability of a project if people can potentially stop it at any one time. So it's a quite a contentious issue. And interestingly, in Europe, looking at the European context, only the Nordic countries actually have an acknowledged Indigenous peoples group.
Okay, so that's only one, kind of very important but small part of Europe where there's actually that acknowledged group that's there.
Yes.
That almost feels quite remarkable with regards to that, and especially because, as we've mentioned previously, this is not a isn't kind of understanding people's perceptions and what they're looking for in a situation, of course varies wildly depending on the person, depending on that broader context, etc. So with regards to I guess, be it free prior informed consent, be it social performance, social license to operate, I imagine that this is something that ideally needs to start as early as possible in a project, rather than being something that, great, we're hitting this particular milestone, be it feasibility or whatever, now we need to make sure we've got our FPIC, as it were. I mean, those kind of conversations are often things that you hear being said. So am I correct in saying that you want to be starting this as early as possible, but also being open to the fact that this isn't a tick box thing, this is something that can change?
Well, yes, very much so. I mean, if you think about a project, I mean, from a social change and social impact, but definitely a social change and a social risk sort of perspective, you affect change as soon as you arrive in an area. So as soon as there are boots on the ground, as soon as you are talking to local people, which invariably, reconnaissance and exploration geologists are, you are starting sort of to influence the area and influence the way people think about what you are doing, and starting to either raise expectations or raise concerns about what you are planning to do, where it will go. And, how many projects move from reconnaissance through to exploration, through to advanced exploration, through to development, through to operation. That filter, it decreases and decreases and decreases and decreases and distills down and down and down and down and down. But from the reconnaissance projects all the way down, you are affecting social change. Therefore, you are creating potential uncertainty, and in your world of risk, you will know through uncertainty you generate risk. So that happens from that moment. For all of those projects involved in reconnaissance activity, you are starting to develop and generate sort of potential social risk that needs to be managed to, if the results are good, to add value to your project. If the results aren't good, to be able to walk away without leaving a legacy of distrust for the next guys that come along. So it's about the legacy of mineral exploration and what that leads, but also with the anticipation that a project could actually, as it filters down, it could actually become a meaningful project. You've then got in amongst that, and again, you'll be very familiar with this as well, Sarah, that ownership. How many transfers of ownership occur between a reconnaissance project and an operating mine? A project can move through 10 different owners at least during this process. As soon as some companies are out there just to identify a target, which they can sell on to an exploration company. That's their bread and butter. Some companies want the exploration so they can sell on to a developer. There are very, very few projects out there that start with reconnaissance and stay with the same ownership through to closure. It's very, very few. So with each ownership, you have commitments that are made, you have promises that are made. If those commitments, if those promises aren't recorded, if they don't continue, you end up with a community being committed to, having promises, and a company that has no knowledge. And again, the risks that result from that, and the issues and problems that result from that then can contribute to risks, just become manifold. So in terms of social license to operate, I used to say as soon as you break earth, but I've actually revised my thinking to it's actually as soon as there are boots on the ground. And as soon as you are talking with people, you need to start considering what you are saying, what you are committing to, what expectations you are potentially raising, what concerns you are potentially instigating in and with these people. And that doesn't matter where you are in the world, that is there.
And I guess, I mean, with that as well, I mean, Cathryn, if we're being really proactive about it, we should actually be considering this before there are boots on the ground. So when you're actually, assessing an area and saying, look, do we have the appetite to go and work in this area, not just because of the geology and the infrastructure and everything, but actually that social context, the environmental context as well. And that timeline going from very like before you go there all the way through, not to necessarily just closure, but that post closure. So as you mentioned, what's the legacy that you leave behind? And is it that net positive, not that net zero? Actually, we're looking for a gain in terms of that social context, I suspect. Would that be correct?
Yes, it is. It is. And, and from that initial screening as well, if coming back to the hornet's nest analogy, if it is a hornet's nest, go into it knowingly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Understand your context. Don't walk into it sort of with without without any protection, and social protection. So, if there are issues there, understand them, because those social, no matter what's going on underneath the ground, in terms of potential minerals you want to access, understanding what's happening above ground and understanding people's values and relationship and the complexities of that social fabric is crucial to enabling you to have a viable project. And as we've seen, it took Ernst & Young to put social license as the number one business risk for people really to start to consider it. But all of those years when people were making mistakes have ended up with the minerals and mining sector being the least trusted sector and the perceived as the most damaging sector by the population of the world globally. And why is that? Why is, it is because there was a lack of consideration for the social risks and the social issues, and a lack of understanding and realization that this is complex and it requires a particular skill set in terms of being able to develop, manage, and integrate with communities and people. And then sadly, that realization is there now, but the mining sector is distrusted and it's having to play a huge game of catch up. And if we link this back to the green economy and where we're going in terms of the EU's Green Deal or the general greening, ultimately everything that we require for human life is either farmed or dug. So it's either dug up from the ground or it's farmed or it's grown, so it's either grown or it's dug up from the ground. And so we cannot live from air and water alone. We need other minerals, sort of nutrients, and how we access these requires both agriculture and a mineral extraction sector. Farming, for the most part, is not distrusted. The farmers are seen relatively as the good guys, but the mining sector is not, and yet we would depend on it. And it's how do we manage, how do we mitigate this lack of trust that is out there? How do we redress this global loss of a social license to enable us to be able to identify and assess and extract the minerals that we depend on to enable our planet to survive, but also our population to thrive?
Yeah, so how do we do all of this sustainably, I guess, and for that long term, where we're trying to get to eventually? So with that, I mean, you've described a big mountain that needs to be climbed here, but I'm sure there must be some good case studies out there and good practice that we can learn from, and we can say, oh, well, look, that worked over there. What can we learn from that? Would that work in my context? Or hang on a second, that looked like a good idea, but it didn't work over there. Well, let's understand why, and we can pull that in. Have you got any good case studies to share, or any advice as to where we can go to learn more about this stuff?
Okay, so in terms of case studies, I mean, there's one small project that I had to sort of hold up and say I'm actually involved in, but it's why I'm involved and why I'm involved at an early stage, I think is testament sort of to the ideology behind sort of the project developers. There is a Norwegian company called Akobo Minerals that is actually at advanced exploration stage in Ethiopia at the moment, in southern Ethiopia. And what they have undertaken to do, and they're just at their sort of the scoping stage at the moment, so they're in the process of completing their preliminary sort of economic analysis for this project. But we've been working with them for the last 12 months or so, and they decided that they wanted to make sure that their project has a small an environmental footprint as possible. It is manageable, but also they wanted to make sure that they truly considered all of the potential social ramifications and issues, and they wanted to look at how they could contribute effectively to the area from a sustainability perspective, that would be both of value to their project, but of value also to the area, the region in which that hosts them. So they've really sort of bought into the notion of a shared value approach. And by shared value, it actually comes from the Harvard Business sort of Review, the term initially, but it's about looking at how you can improve the profitability of your company as well as the economic viability and economic development, sustainable economic development of an area in which you're working. So it's looking at those shared values. What are the opportunities for maximizing potential for both your business, but also the area in which you are working? And so we've been working with them, looking at the area. We've carried out some remote sensing of the area to identify the different sort of the status of land use, but also the opportunities for looking at sort of rehabilitation and development of the ecosystem services in the area. And we're now at sort of the late stage of working with them and the communities that in and around their mineral exploration and their proposed mining concession area, and the regional sort of government structures, to develop something called a payment for ecosystem services scheme. There's been a lot in the press of late about carbon and carbon costing and reaching net zero by 2050. People are looking at tree planting and they're looking at carbon credits, but really reaching net zero is so much more than just the carbon credits and the tree planting. It is about all of the other ecosystem services that the natural resources provide, in terms of the regulatory services, the supporting services, the provisioning services, the food that we eat, and also the cultural services in terms of an area as well, and people's value and relationship and recreational relationship with the land and the water, etc. So we are working with this company to develop a payment for ecosystem services scheme that will support the communities in and around the project to establish and manage, based on their priorities and their relationship with the natural resources base, a program that would enable them to both conserve, manage and rehabilitate the environment and develop and pursue and extend sustainable livelihood opportunities that enable them to actually to generate income through their management of the natural resources. This income will be generated through the sale of carbon credits, but it will involve so much more than planting trees. and it will also look at areas that have been destroyed by artisanal mining, of which there's a lot in the area, and look at how notions of environmental stewardship can be strengthened and integrated within the local population, building on existing understanding and existing strengths that are currently there. So in doing this project, which again, unusual for an African sort of gold mining project, is going to be underground. It's going to have a small, very small footprint. It's going to contribute to the development of the region in a way that will mean that the communities are in no way dependent on the mining project. So they have a coexistence as a good neighbour, as a development partner, that will only really stand them in good stead moving forwards. And also when it comes to closure, will enable them to start to actually to consider closure from the outset, because they will not have created a huge level of dependency, which is one of the biggest social issues that mining closure projects have. How do we reduce this dependency after being here for 10 years? How do we extricate ourselves without just leaving depression? And in terms of depression, environmental depression in the land, environmental degradation, but also social depression. How do we do this? And so it's very exciting, and it's definitely one to watch.
That's brilliant, Cathryn. I can't wait to see more about that in the near future as it develops as well. It's really exciting. So just, I guess, in closing, firstly, where can I go to learn more? But also, secondly, do you have any final hints and tips for people who are interested in social license to operate and everything else that comes with that?
Okay, well, this is a short sort of video for responsible raw materials. So, as a fantastic online platform, I would invite people sort of to dig in and delve and look at some of the other videos you have on here, and sort of some of the amazing sort of presentations that you have on the site, sort of from the events that you've run in the past. So my first signpost would be to responsible raw materials. I'm a huge fan. Secondly, sort of my organisation, Susani Associates, we are a team of social performance practitioners, social performance specialists, advising the minerals and mining sector. This is what we're doing with Akobo, and also, with the work that we do with yourselves, Satala, and various other consultancies, sort of, globally supporting and enabling sort of companies in the natural resources sector, not just minerals and mining, but sort of also, sort of energy and oil and gas and other sort of all natural resources sector, to adopt responsible social performance practice. And then there is a forum called the Social Practice Forum, which is a network of social practitioners, of which I'm proud to be one of. And again, this forum is producing a series of materials. There's a fantastic one on FPIC at the moment, which really sort of just unpicks this quandary and provides some really, really good information that was prepared by a colleague of mine called Janet Fishlock. And then there are various other sort of resources there as well, some which are sort of in the process of coming online, which again introduce some of the issues. So, there are people out there, there are practitioners out there, and there's a lot going on in the world, and it's a case of really, I suppose, looking and really, I suppose, final thoughts would be, it's never too early sort of to consider the social dimension of mineral exploration, mining, and the natural resources sector more widely.
Brilliant. So with that, I guess to everybody, if you're thinking, when should I start this whole endeavour into understanding the social context and the social performance with regards to potential projects, well, now, if not yesterday, with regards to thinking for that. But Cathryn, thank you so much for your time here today. Absolutely brilliant, as always. Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, Cathryn MacCallum. Round of applause. Yay.